Hi, I'm Linda, and I'm 28 years old. Every New Year's Eve, my family throws this elaborate party that everyone in our neighborhood talks about for weeks. This year, I was actually looking forward to it more than usual because I thought maybe, just maybe, things would be different. I'd been working so hard to prove myself to show my mom that I was worthy of being part of this perfect family image she'd spent years crafting. But sometimes the truth has a way of exploding right when you least expect it, shattering everything you thought you knew about your life. Before I dive into what happened that night, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you enjoy family stories that don't always have fairy tale beginnings. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for how this one ends. Growing up in suburban Michigan, my family was what everyone called the picture-perfect American dream. My mother, Patricia, 52 years old, had built a reputation as the neighborhood's premier hostess. She threw holiday parties that people talked about all year long with elaborate decorations that could rival department store displays and catered food that made everyone feel like they were dining at an upscale restaurant. My father, Robert, 54, worked as a successful insurance broker, the kind of man who always wore perfectly pressed shirts and maintained our pristine lawn like it was his personal masterpiece. He was the steady, quiet presence who funded Patricia's social ambitions while staying comfortably in the background. Then there was my older brother Michael, 30 years old, who had achieved everything my parents dreamed of in a child. He worked at a prestigious accounting firm, lived in a beautiful colonial house just 3 miles from our family home, and was married to Jennifer, a sweet elementary school teacher. They had 2 adorable kids, Emma and Jack, who my parents absolutely doted on. Michael was the golden child who could do no wrong, the son who validated every parenting decision my mother had ever made. My younger sister Susan, 25, was well on her way to following the same perfect path. She was studying to become a teacher just like our mother had always encouraged and had recently gotten engaged to David, a dependable guy who worked in local government. Patricia loved to show off Susan's engagement ring at every opportunity, telling everyone about the spring wedding they were planning. And then there was me, Linda, the middle child, who never quite fit the mold my family had created. While my siblings pursued what my parents called stable, respectable careers, I had chosen to become a freelance graphic designer. I loved the creativity, the flexibility, the ability to work with different clients on projects that actually excited me. But to my family, freelance meant unstable, unpredictable, irresponsible. I was still single at 28, which in my mother's social circle might as well have been a personal failure. While Michael and Susan had settled in the suburbs, maintaining the family tradition of perfectly manicured lawns and neighborhood barbecues, I lived in a small but charming apartment downtown, surrounded by artists, young professionals, and people who didn't judge my life choices. Our annual New Year's Eve party had been a family tradition for 15 years. Patricia invited the same people every year, extended family, longtime neighbors. Her book club friends, colleagues from the school where she used to teach before becoming a full-time homemaker and social coordinator. The guest list was carefully curated to include only people who would appreciate her efforts and reflect well on our family's status in the community. The preparations always began weeks in advance. Patricia would spend hours planning the menu, coordinating with caterers, selecting decorations that matched whatever theme she had chosen for the year. The house would be transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a magazine, with sparkling lights, elegant table settings, and fresh flower arrangements in every room. She took pride in the fact that people would talk about our party for months afterward. I had always helped with the setup, arriving early to assist with decorations and food preparation. But over the years, I began to notice that my role felt less like a beloved daughter helping with a family celebration, and more like hired help who happened to share the family name. While Michael and Susan were encouraged to mingle with guests and enjoy the party, I was always assigned to kitchen duty, serving drinks, clearing plates, and handling the endless stream of tasks that kept the evening running smoothly. This year felt different, though. In recent months, Patricia had been making increasingly pointed comments about my life choices. At family dinners, she would bring up my career with barely concealed disapproval, wondering aloud when I was going to find a real job with benefits and security. She made subtle but cutting remarks about my single status, asking when I was going to settle down and start thinking about my future seriously. Just 2 weeks before the party, we'd had a particularly difficult family dinner where she openly criticized what she called my unstable lifestyle. She suggested that maybe it was time for me to consider moving back home temporarily, just until I could get my life together. The implication was clear. She saw me as a failure, a disappointment, someone who needed to be fixed rather than celebrated. But I was determined to keep the peace. Despite the growing resentment I felt toward my mother's constant judgment, I wanted to believe that family came first. I told myself that if I just tried harder, if I proved myself more convincingly, maybe I could earn the acceptance and pride that seemed to come so naturally to my siblings. On the day of the party, I arrived at my childhood home 3 hours early, ready to help transform the house into Patricia's vision of perfection. The moment I walked through the front door, I could feel the familiar tension that had become our normal dynamic. Patricia took one look at my outfit, a stylish black dress that I thought struck the perfect balance between sophisticated and festive, and immediately frowned. "Linda, that dress is a bit too casual for tonight, don't you think?" she said, not even bothering with a greeting. "This is an important evening. Mrs. Henderson from the school board will be here along with the Johnsons from Robert's office. I need everything to be just right." I swallowed my frustration and simply nodded, heading straight to the kitchen where Patricia had laid out my assignments for the evening. While Michael and Susan would be free to socialize and enjoy themselves, I was given a detailed list of tasks: arrange the appetizer platters, make sure the bar was fully stocked, coordinate with the catering staff, and basically handle anything that might interfere with Patricia's ability to play the gracious hostess. As I worked in the kitchen, I could hear Patricia on the phone with various guests confirming arrival times and dietary restrictions. Her voice was warm and welcoming, the perfect tone of someone who genuinely loved bringing people together. But when she hung up and spoke to me, that warmth disappeared, replaced by the crisp, businesslike tone she might use with a contractor or service provider. The evening was about to begin, and I could already feel the familiar ache of being essential to the party's success, but invisible to its social fabric. I was needed but not wanted, useful but not valued. Still, I held on to hope that maybe this year would be different, that maybe I could find a way to be seen as a daughter, rather than just an extra pair of hands. As the guests began arriving at 7 o'clock, the house filled with the warm buzz of conversation and laughter that made these gatherings feel magical. Extended family members streamed through the front door, bringing hugs, gifts, and the kind of genuine affection that made me remember why I loved these people despite the complicated dynamics with my mother. Aunt Margaret, my father's sister, arrived with her usual dramatic flourish, immediately pulling me into a tight hug while asking her predictable questions about my love life. "Linda, honey, please tell me you've met someone special. You're too beautiful and smart to be spending all your time alone in that little apartment." Her concern was genuine, but it still stung to have my worth measured primarily by my relationship status. Uncle Tom, married to Aunt Margaret for 35 years, gave me his customary pat on the shoulder while making his well-intentioned but slightly patronizing joke about me being a career woman. "Still conquering the business world, Linda, good for you, though I don't know how you manage without a good man to take care of you." He meant well, but his comment reflected the same outdated thinking that seemed to permeate my entire family's worldview. My cousins arrived with their own families, each one representing another version of the life my parents thought I should be living. Cousin Rachel brought her husband and 3 young children, immediately launching into stories about soccer practices and school plays. Cousin Mark showed up with his wife and newborn baby, receiving the kind of enthusiastic attention that new parents always get at family gatherings. Watching everyone fuss over the baby, I felt the familiar pang of being the odd one out, the family member who hadn't yet achieved the milestones that seemed to matter most to everyone else. As the evening progressed and more guests arrived, Patricia moved through the house like a gracious queen holding court. She had a gift for making everyone feel welcome and important, sharing updates about her children's achievements with obvious pride and maternal satisfaction. Michael just got another promotion at his firm, she told Mrs. Henderson from the school board, her voice practically glowing with maternal pride. "He's being considered for partner track, and Jennifer is doing such wonderful work with her second-grade class. They're thinking about buying a bigger house now that the children are getting older," when Mr. and Mrs. Johnson from Robert's office asked about Susan. Patricia's enthusiasm was equally infectious. "Susan is having the most beautiful spring wedding," she gushed, pulling out her phone to show photos of venues and dress fittings. "David is such a wonderful young man, and they're already talking about starting a family right away. I couldn't be more thrilled about gaining such a lovely son-in-law." But when guests inevitably asked about me, Patricia's energy shifted noticeably. Her smile became tighter, her voice took on a slightly strained quality, and her answers became vague and deflective. "Oh, Linda is still figuring things out," she would say with a forced laugh. "You know how it is with young people these days. They take their time finding their path." The phrase "figuring things out" stung every time I heard it. I wasn't figuring anything out. I had a career, I loved clients who respected my work, and a life that felt authentic and fulfilling to me. But in Patricia's narrative, anything that didn't follow the traditional script of marriage, mortgage, and motherhood was just a phase to be endured until I came to my senses. From my position in the kitchen, where I spent most of the evening managing the endless flow of appetizers and drinks, I could overhear these conversations. Each time my name came up, I found myself holding my breath, hoping this time would be different, that maybe Patricia would mention my recent success, landing a major client, or the positive feedback I'd been getting from my work. But it never happened. Instead, I watched as she regaled guests with detailed stories about Michael's professional achievements and Susan's wedding plans, while treating my life like a minor inconvenience that would hopefully resolve itself soon. When neighbors complimented the beautiful graphic design work on the party invitations I had created for her, Patricia accepted the praise without mentioning that her own daughter had designed them. The most painful moment came when I overheard Patricia talking to her friend Carol from book club. "I'm so proud of Michael and Susan," she said, her voice carrying clearly to where I stood arranging another tray of appetizers. "They've both turned out exactly as I hoped. It's such a blessing to see your children make good choices and build stable, happy lives." The implication was crystal clear. Michael and Susan had made good choices. I apparently had not. Standing there in the kitchen that had become my assigned domain for the evening, I felt the familiar weight of never being quite good enough, never measuring up to the standards that seemed to come so naturally to my siblings. But I pushed down my hurt feelings and continued working, determined to make the evening perfect, even if I wasn't going to be celebrated as part of that perfection. I told myself that family meant accepting people as they were, even when they couldn't seem to do the same for you. I held on to the hope that eventually, if I just proved myself enough, worked hard enough, tried hard enough, things would change. As we approached 11 o'clock and the traditional midnight countdown, I could feel the anticipation building in the house. This was always the highlight of Patricia's parties, the moment when she would gather everyone together for photos and the champagne toast that marked the transition into a new year. Despite everything, I found myself looking forward to being part of that moment, to standing with my family as we welcomed whatever the next year would bring. I had no idea that in less than an hour, everything I thought I knew about my place in this family would be completely destroyed. As 11:30 approached, Patricia began orchestrating the evening's crescendo with her usual meticulous attention to detail. She moved through the house like a conductor preparing for the finale of a symphony, checking that champagne glasses were filled, adjusting decorations that had shifted throughout the evening, and making sure every guest felt included in the approaching midnight celebration. "Everyone please gather in the living room," Patricia announced in her warm hostess voice that carried easily over the conversation and laughter. "We're going to do our traditional family photo before the countdown begins, and I want to make sure we capture this beautiful evening with all our wonderful friends and family." The living room had been prepared for this moment all evening. Patricia had arranged the furniture to create the perfect backdrop, with our family positioned prominently in the center, while guests formed a warm circle around us. The lighting was soft and flattering, the decorations provided an elegant background, and everything was designed to create the kind of photo that would go into frames and Christmas cards, preserving this perfect family moment for posterity. I watched as Michael and Jennifer gathered their children with little Emma and Jack, adding their adorable energy to the scene. Susan stood close to David, her engagement ring catching the light as she laughed at something he whispered in her ear. Robert took his customary position slightly behind Patricia, the supportive husband who provided stability while letting his wife shine in the spotlight. Automatically, without even thinking about it, I moved to join my family in the center of the group. After spending the entire evening working behind the scenes to make this party successful, I was finally ready to step forward and be part of the celebration. This was my family. These were my people, and despite all the complicated dynamics, I belonged here too. But the moment I moved toward the family grouping, I saw Patricia's expression change. The warm, welcoming smile she had been wearing all evening disappeared, replaced by a look of annoyance that she didn't bother to hide. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she watched me approach, and I could feel the temperature in the room shift, even though I couldn't quite understand why. "Linda," Patricia said, her voice suddenly sharp and carrying clearly across the room in a way that made several guests turn to look. "Could you please go check on the appetizers in the kitchen? I want to make sure everything is still properly arranged for our guests." The request hit me like a slap. Here I was trying to join my family for what was supposed to be the most important moment of the evening, and my mother was asking me to leave. Not asking, really. The tone of her voice made it clear this wasn't a request, but a command delivered with the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. But something inside me rebelled against the familiar pattern of exclusion. I had spent the entire evening working to make this party perfect, handling every detail that allowed Patricia to play the gracious hostess without worrying about logistics. I had smiled and served and cleaned and coordinated, while my siblings enjoyed themselves as honored family members. Now, at the one moment when we were all supposed to come together as a family, she wanted to send me away again. "It's almost midnight, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice calm and reasonable, despite the frustration building inside me. "I want to be here for the toast with everyone else." "The appetizers can wait 5 minutes." I could feel the attention of the entire room focusing on our exchange. 30 guests who had been chatting and laughing moments before were now watching this unexpected tension between mother and daughter play out in real time. The easy, festive atmosphere was beginning to shift into something uncomfortable and strained. Patricia's face flushed slightly, whether from embarrassment at being challenged in front of her guests or anger at my refusal to simply obey her command. Her voice got sharper, more insistent, carrying an edge that made it clear she expected this disagreement to end immediately. "Linda, I need you to handle the kitchen right now," she said, emphasizing each word in a way that left no room for interpretation. "This is important, and I'm counting on you to take care of it." But I had reached my breaking point. After years of being treated like hired help at family gatherings, after an entire evening of being excluded from the social aspects of the party, while being essential to its practical success, I simply couldn't bring myself to walk away from this moment too. "It's midnight, Mom." I repeated, my voice stronger now, more determined. "I want to toast the new year with my family. I want to be in the photo with everyone else. The kitchen can wait." The words hung in the air between us, and I could see Patricia's composure beginning to crack. She was used to having her requests followed without question, especially from me. My refusal to comply was throwing off her carefully orchestrated evening, creating exactly the kind of scene she had spent weeks trying to avoid. The room had gone completely silent now. 30 guests were watching this family drama unfold, and I could feel their discomfort as the festive atmosphere dissolved into something much more serious and painful. Aunt Margaret was staring at us with obvious concern, Uncle Tom looked confused and worried, and my cousins were exchanging glances that suggested they were witnessing something they didn't fully understand, but knew wasn't normal. Michael and Susan were frozen in place, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation, but unsure how to intervene. Robert looked like he wanted to disappear entirely, his usual strategy for dealing with family conflict. Patricia stood there for a moment, her face getting redder, her carefully maintained hostess mask beginning to slip away entirely. When she spoke again, her voice was loud enough for everyone in the room to hear clearly, and the words that came out of her mouth changed everything forever. "You don't belong in this family." The silence that followed was deafening. 30 people holding champagne glasses, dressed in their party clothes, ready to celebrate the new year, suddenly found themselves witnessing the complete destruction of a family relationship in real time. But Patricia wasn't finished. As if the first blow hadn't been devastating enough, she delivered the second one with equal force. "Why don't you just leave?" The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. 28 years of subtle exclusion, of feeling like I never quite measured up, of being treated differently from my siblings, suddenly crystallized into this one devastating moment of absolute rejection. You don't belong in this family. Standing there in the center of my childhood living room, surrounded by 30 guests who were now staring at me with a mixture of shock, pity, and uncomfortable fascination, I felt every defense I had built up over the years crumble away. This wasn't just a moment of anger or frustration. This was my mother telling me in front of everyone who mattered to our family that I was not wanted, not valued, not truly part of the unit that defined my entire identity. The room was so quiet, I could hear the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner counting down the seconds until midnight, until the moment that was supposed to mark a fresh start and new beginnings. Instead, it felt like I was watching the end of everything I thought I knew about my life. Aunt Margaret had gasped audibly when Patricia spoke, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. Uncle Tom was staring at my mother with an expression of complete disbelief, as if he couldn't process what he had just heard. The neighbors who had known our family for years looked stunned and uncomfortable, clearly wishing they were anywhere else but witnessing this family implosion. My cousins were exchanging worried glances, their children picking up on the adult tension, even if they didn't understand what was happening. Michael and Susan stood frozen, their faces pale with shock. Even Robert, who usually managed to stay invisible during family conflicts, was staring at his wife with an expression I had never seen before. But Patricia seemed oblivious to the impact of her words. Having delivered her devastating blow, she turned away from me as if the matter was settled, as if she had simply resolved a minor scheduling conflict rather than destroyed her daughter's sense of belonging and worth. She began moving toward the champagne table, apparently ready to continue with the evening's festivities, as if nothing significant had happened. In that moment, watching my mother dismiss me so completely, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was 28 years of accumulated hurt finally reaching a breaking point. Maybe it was the humiliation of being rejected so publicly in front of people I cared about. Or maybe it was simply the clarity that comes when you finally see a situation for what it really is, rather than what you've been hoping it could become. I took a deep breath, feeling strangely calm despite the emotional earthquake happening inside me. When I spoke, my voice was steady and clear, carrying across the silent room to reach every person present. "You're absolutely right, Patricia," I said, using her first name instead of Mom, for the first time in my adult life. The formal address felt like drawing a line in the sand, establishing a new dynamic between us. "I don't belong in this family." I could see the surprise in her face as she turned back toward me. She had expected me to leave quietly, to slink away in shame and defeat, as I had done so many times before when faced with her disapproval. The last thing she expected was for me to agree with her assessment and take control of the narrative. But I wasn't finished. Reaching into my purse with hands that were surprisingly steady, I pulled out a manila envelope that I had been carrying for weeks, uncertain if I would ever have the courage to use its contents. Tonight my mother had given me all the courage I needed. "Because 28 years ago you adopted me and never told me." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Gasps and exclamations erupted from guests throughout the room. Aunt Margaret's champagne glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. Uncle Tom stepped forward with an expression of complete shock, while several neighbors began whispering urgently to each other. Patricia's face went completely white, all the color draining away as if I had physically struck her. Her mouth opened and closed without any sound coming out, and for the first time in my life, I saw my composed, controlling mother rendered completely speechless. "I found these last month when I was helping you clean the attic." I continued pulling the legal documents from the envelope. "Hidden in a box behind your old Christmas decorations. Birth certificate with a different name, adoption decree, medical records that finally explain why my blood type never made sense in our family." Robert stepped forward, his face pale with panic, but I held up my hand to stop him. This was my moment, my truth to tell, and I wasn't going to let anyone else control the narrative anymore. "I've spent the last month working with a private investigator, tracing my real background, understanding why I never felt like I truly belonged here," I said, my voice getting stronger with each word. "And now I finally understand why nothing I ever did was good enough for you, Patricia. You've resented having to raise someone else's child for 28 years. The room erupted in voices as family members began demanding answers. Aunt Margaret's voice cut through the chaos. "Patricia, is this true? How could you keep this secret for so long?" Uncle Tom was asking, "What about the rest of us? Did anyone else know?" Cousins were looking at each other in confusion, trying to process this complete revision of our family history. But my focus remained on Patricia, who was still standing there in stunned silence, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. The party she had planned so meticulously, the perfect family image she had spent decades building, the social status she had cultivated through years of gracious hostessing, all of it was dissolving in real time as the truth finally came to light. Through the large windows, I could see neighbors' houses lit up with their own New Year's celebrations, people counting down to midnight in happiness and hope. But in our living room, time seemed suspended in this moment of revelation and reckoning. I looked around at the faces of people I had known my entire life, seeing shock, confusion, sympathy, and something else, something that looked like respect. For the first time in 28 years, I wasn't the disappointing daughter or the family member who didn't quite fit. I was the person who had finally spoken the truth that everyone needed to hear. The aftermath of my revelation hit the room like a tsunami, with waves of shock and disbelief crashing over everyone present. Family members who had known me my entire life were suddenly seeing 28 years of family dynamics through a completely different lens, and the implications were staggering. Michael was the first to break the stunned silence, stepping forward with tears in his eyes that I had never seen before. "Linda," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "we had no idea. All these years, Susan and I never knew." He looked toward Patricia with an expression that mixed hurt and anger. "How could you keep something like this from us? How could you keep it from her?" Susan was openly crying now, her carefully applied makeup running down her cheeks as she moved toward me. "You're still our sister," she said fiercely, reaching out to take my hand. "Adopted or not, you're still our sister. Nothing changes that." Her words carried a conviction that surprised me, and for the first time all evening, I felt like someone in my immediate family was truly on my side. But Patricia was having none of it. Faced with the complete collapse of her carefully maintained secret, she chose to double down rather than acknowledge any wrongdoing. Her shock was rapidly transforming into defensive anger, and when she spoke, her voice was shrill and desperate. "Those papers don't mean anything," she said, gesturing wildly at the documents I was still holding. "I raised you. I fed you and clothed you and gave you a home when your real mother didn't want you. I sacrificed my life to take care of someone else's mistake." The cruelty of her words sent another wave of gasps through the room. To hear her describe my adoption as taking care of someone else's mistake was devastating, but it also revealed the truth about how she had viewed me for my entire life. I wasn't her daughter. I was a burden, an obligation, a reminder of something she had never wanted to do in the first place. Robert finally found his voice, though it came out weak and shaky. "Patricia, stop," he said, looking horrified by his wife's words. "That's enough. This isn't how we should be handling this." But Patricia turned on him with fury that had been building for decades. Don't you dare tell me how to handle this, Robert. This was your idea. Remember, you were the one who pushed for the adoption when we couldn't have more children after Michael. You were the one who said it would be good for our family. Well, look how that turned out. The revelation that my father had been the driving force behind my adoption, while my mother had been reluctant, added another layer of complexity to the situation. Robert's face crumpled with what looked like years of suppressed guilt and regret. Extended family members were no longer just shocked observers. They were actively taking sides, and the battle lines were becoming clear. Aunt Margaret stepped forward with fire in her eyes, pointing an accusatory finger at Patricia. 30 years, Patricia. 30 years of family gatherings where we all loved Linda as our niece, never knowing you were treating her like some kind of second-class citizen in her own home. How could you do that to a child? How could you do that to all of us? Uncle Tom was shaking his head in disbelief. Patricia, I've watched Linda grow up. I've seen how hard she tries to please you, how much she wants your approval. And all this time you've been... He couldn't even finish the sentence, seemingly unable to find words for the level of emotional cruelty he was witnessing. My cousins were rallying around me too, with Rachel stepping forward to say, Linda, we've always considered you family. This doesn't change anything about how we feel about you. If anything, it explains why Patricia has always seemed so cold toward you at family gatherings. The neighbors were beginning to look extremely uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that they were witnessing something deeply personal and painful, that they had no business being part of. Several couples were quietly gathering their coats and purses, making subtle moves toward the door, while trying not to draw attention to their departure. But I wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and 28 years of suppressed hurt and confusion were pouring out all at once. You want to talk about sacrifice, Patricia? I said, my voice gaining strength as I continued. Let's talk about the sacrifice of growing up feeling like nothing I did was ever good enough. Let's talk about the sacrifice of watching you beam with pride over Michael and Susan while treating my achievements like they were barely worth mentioning. Let's talk about the sacrifice of spending my entire life wondering why my own mother seemed to resent my existence. Patricia's face was getting redder with each word, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. I did the best I could with an impossible situation, she shot back. Do you have any idea how hard it was to raise a child who wasn't mine, to love someone else's baby the same way I loved my own children? The admission that she had never loved me the same way she loved Michael, and Susan was perhaps the most honest thing she had said all evening, and also the most devastating. But it also confirmed what I had suspected my entire life and gave me a strange sense of validation. At least now I know why, I said quietly. At least now I understand that it wasn't something wrong with me. It was something wrong with you. The room fell silent again as the full weight of our family's dysfunction became clear to everyone present. 28 years of lies. Resentment and emotional neglect were being laid bare in front of 30 witnesses, and there was no going back from this moment. Robert was staring at Patricia as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time in decades, and what he saw seemed to horrify him. Michael and Susan were holding each other, both crying as they processed the realization that their sister had been suffering in silence for her entire life, while they enjoyed the full warmth of their parents' love and approval. But perhaps most significantly, I felt something I had never experienced before in my relationship with my family. For the first time in my life, I was not the problem that needed to be fixed. I was not the disappointment that needed to be managed. I was the truth teller, the person brave enough to finally name the dysfunction that had poisoned our family dynamics for decades. The grandfather clock in the corner began chiming midnight, marking the arrival of the new year that was supposed to bring hope and fresh starts. But instead of celebration, we were all standing in the wreckage of everything we thought we knew about our family. The days following the New Year's Eve confrontation felt like living in the aftermath of an earthquake with aftershocks, continuing to reshape the landscape of our family relationships. I stayed at my friend Jessica's apartment downtown, needing space to process what had happened and decide how I wanted to move forward with the wreckage of my family dynamics. My phone rang constantly during those first few days, but the calls weren't coming from Patricia. Instead, Michael and Susan reached out repeatedly, both of them seeming desperate to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of honesty rather than the lies that had shaped our childhood. Michael called me on January 2nd, his voice heavy with guilt and regret. "Linda, I need you to know that Susan and I have been talking nonstop since New Year's Eve," he said. "We've been going over our childhood, thinking about all the times we noticed Mom treating you differently but didn't say anything. We should have stood up for you. We should have questioned why you always seemed to be walking on eggshells around her." His admission meant more to me than he probably realized. For years I had wondered if I was imagining the different treatment or being overly sensitive about normal family dynamics. Having my siblings confirm that they had noticed the inequality validated decades of confusion and hurt. Susan's call came the next day, and she was even more emotional. "I keep thinking about all the family photos where you're standing slightly apart from the rest of us," she said through tears. "Or how Mom would light up when teachers praised me at school but barely acknowledge your achievements. I thought it was just her personality, but now I understand it was so much worse than that." Both of my siblings were processing their own guilt about being beneficiaries of a system that had excluded me, and they were determined to make amends. More importantly, they were making it clear that their loyalty was with me, not with Patricia's version of events. Extended family members were also reaching out, with Aunt Margaret calling to apologize for years of not recognizing what was happening right in front of her. "I should have seen it," she said, her voice filled with regret. "I should have questioned why Patricia always seemed so cold toward you. But I guess I wanted to believe that everything was fine because it was easier than dealing with the truth." Uncle Tom sent a long email expressing similar sentiments and making it clear that as far as the extended family was concerned, I was, and always had been, a beloved family member regardless of the circumstances of my birth. "Adoption doesn't make you less family," he wrote. "If anything, it makes you more family because you were chosen and welcomed. The fact that Patricia couldn't see that is her loss, not yours." The response from family, friends, and neighbors was equally supportive. Mrs. Henderson from the school board called to say that Patricia's behavior at the party had been shocking and inappropriate, and that everyone who witnessed it was concerned about me. Several neighbors stopped by Jessica's apartment to check on me and express their disapproval of how the situation had been handled. But Patricia remained completely silent. No calls, no texts, no attempts at communication whatsoever. According to Michael, she was refusing to discuss the situation at all, maintaining that I had destroyed the family by revealing the adoption and that everything that happened was my fault for being ungrateful and disrespectful. Robert, however, was a different story. On January 5th, he called and asked if he could meet with me privately. When we sat down at a coffee shop near Jessica's apartment, he looked like he had aged 10 years in less than a week. "Linda, I need to explain my part in all of this," he said, his hands shaking slightly as he held his coffee cup. "When we found out Patricia couldn't have more children after Michael, I was the one who suggested adoption. I thought it would be good for our family that Michael would benefit from having siblings and that we could provide a loving home for a child who needed one." He paused, struggling with emotions that seemed to have been suppressed for decades. "I never realized how much Patricia resented the decision. She went along with it because I pushed for it, but she never fully accepted you as her daughter. I should have protected you from that. I should have stood up to her when I saw how differently she treated you. Instead, I told myself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that you were resilient enough to handle it." His admission of his own failures was painful, but also healing in a way. For the first time in my life, someone from my immediate family was acknowledging that my childhood had been unfair and that the adults responsible for my well-being had failed me. "I want to try to build a real relationship with you," he continued. "Not the superficial one where I stood in the background while Patricia controlled everything, but an actual father-daughter relationship based on honesty and respect. I know I don't deserve that chance, but I'm asking for it anyway." Meanwhile, my investigation into my birth family was progressing with the help of the private investigator I had hired. We had located my birth mother, a woman named Carol, who lived about 2 hours away and had spent 28 years wondering what had happened to the daughter she had given up for adoption as a scared 18-year-old. The initial contact had been emotional for both of us. Carol explained that she had been pressured by her parents to give me up for adoption, but had never stopped thinking about me or wondering if I was happy and healthy. She had tried to find me several times over the years, but had been blocked by the sealed adoption records. "I always hoped that someday you might want to know about your birth family," she told me during our first phone conversation. "I have so much I want to tell you about your biological father, about your medical history, about the family you come from. But mostly, I just want you to know that giving you up was the hardest thing I ever did, and not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about you." The contrast between Carol's obvious love and regret and Patricia's resentment and rejection was stark and painful. Here was a woman who had given me up because she felt she couldn't provide for me properly, while the woman who raised me had spent 28 years making me feel unwanted and burdensome. As the weeks passed, the new family dynamic began to stabilize around a different structure. Michael, Susan, and I were building stronger relationships than we had ever had before, bonded by shared truth, rather than shared illusions. Robert was making genuine efforts to connect with me as an individual, rather than just going along with Patricia's treatment of me. But Patricia remained isolated, refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing or participate in any kind of reconciliation process. According to my siblings, she had become increasingly bitter and defensive, blaming everyone else for the situation while refusing to examine her own behavior. The extended family had essentially chosen sides, with most of them supporting me and expressing their disappointment in Patricia's decades of deception and emotional cruelty. Family gatherings were being reorganized around Patricia's absence, rather than her presence, marking a fundamental shift in our family's power structure. I was beginning to understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to accept treatment that diminishes your worth. By standing up for myself at that New Year's Eve party, I had not only freed myself from a lifetime of seeking approval that would never come, but I had also freed my family from the dysfunction that had been poisoning our relationships for decades. 6 months after that life-changing New Year's Eve confrontation, I found myself sitting in a different living room surrounded by people who had chosen to be there because they wanted to celebrate with me, not because obligation or social expectation had brought them together. Michael and Susan had helped me organize a small gathering to celebrate my 29th birthday, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt genuinely happy and at peace during a family celebration. The guest list was smaller, but infinitely more meaningful than Patricia's elaborate parties had ever been. Michael and Jennifer were there with their children, who seemed more relaxed and playful than they had ever been at their grandmother's formal gatherings. Susan and David had driven in from their new apartment, bringing homemade cupcakes and genuine enthusiasm for celebrating another year of my life. Robert had asked permission to attend, and after some consideration, I had agreed. Our relationship was still fragile and tentative, but he was making consistent efforts to connect with me as an individual, rather than just going through the motions of family obligation. He brought a photo album he had secretly been keeping over the years, filled with pictures of my achievements and milestones that Patricia had never wanted to display in their home. Aunt Margaret and Uncle Tom were there too, along with several cousins who had made it clear that their loyalty was with me regardless of the family drama. The conversation was easy and natural, filled with genuine laughter and the kind of warmth that had always felt forced and artificial at Patricia's gatherings. But perhaps most significantly, Carol was there. My birth mother had driven 2 hours to attend, bringing with her a wealth of stories about my biological father's medical history that finally made sense of some lifelong health quirks and photos of relatives I had never known existed. She also brought something else: unconditional acceptance and love, that asked for nothing in return except the opportunity to know the daughter she had never stopped thinking about. "I know this is complicated," Carol said as we talked quietly in a corner of the room. "I'm not trying to replace the family that raised you or create confusion about your identity. I just want you to know that you come from people who are creative and independent and strong. You get your artistic abilities from your biological father, who was a musician. You get your stubbornness from me," she added with a laugh that sounded remarkably similar to my own. The healing process had not been easy or straightforward. Therapy had helped me understand that Patricia's rejection said nothing about my worth and everything about her own emotional limitations. I was learning to set boundaries with people who couldn't or wouldn't value me appropriately, while also opening myself up to relationships that were based on mutual respect and genuine affection. My career had flourished in ways I never expected once I stopped trying to prove myself to people who were determined not to see my value. The confidence that came from finally understanding my family dynamics had translated into more assertive client relationships and more creative project choices. I was no longer apologizing for my unconventional path or trying to force my life into someone else's definition of success. I had also started dating someone who appreciated my independence and creativity rather than seeing them as character flaws that needed to be corrected. James was a fellow freelancer who understood the challenges and rewards of building a non-traditional career, and he seemed genuinely fascinated by my story rather than threatened by my complexity. Most importantly, I had learned to distinguish between family relationships that nurtured growth and those that demanded conformity. The family I was building around myself was smaller than the one I had grown up in, but it was infinitely more supportive and authentic. Patricia had remained completely estranged from all of us, refusing every attempt at communication or reconciliation. According to neighbors, she had become increasingly isolated, cutting off friendships and family relationships, rather than acknowledging any wrongdoing or examining her own behavior. Her elaborate social life had crumbled along with her carefully maintained image, leaving her alone with the consequences of decades of deception and emotional cruelty. "I feel sorry for her," Susan said during a quiet moment at my birthday celebration. "She's missing out on knowing who you really are, and she's destroying all her other relationships by refusing to admit she was wrong. But I also understand that we can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved." Michael nodded in agreement. "We spent years enabling her treatment of you because it was easier than confronting the truth. But watching you thrive since you stopped trying to win her approval has shown us how toxic that dynamic really was." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. That devastating moment at the New Year's Eve party had felt like the end of my world, but it had actually been the beginning of my real life. I had learned that belonging isn't about being wanted by everyone, but about finding your tribe of people who celebrate who you are, rather than trying to change you into someone else. I had discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away from relationships that diminish your worth, even when those relationships are supposed to be sacred. Most importantly, I had realized that some chapters of our lives must end completely before new ones can begin. The family I had grown up in, with all its dysfunction and deception, had served its purpose in my story. The family I was building now, based on choice and mutual respect, rather than obligation and blood ties, was the one that would carry me forward into whatever came next. Standing in that living room, surrounded by people who had chosen to love and support me, I felt something I had never experienced before, the deep, settled peace that comes from being truly seen and valued for who you are. That New Year's Eve confrontation had destroyed one version of my life, but it had also created space for something infinitely better to grow in its place. As I blew out the candles on my birthday cupcakes, I made a wish not for reconciliation with those who had rejected me, but for continued growth in the relationships that nurtured the best parts of who I was becoming. Sometimes the greatest gift life can give you is the clarity to see which relationships deserve your energy and which ones need to be released with love and gratitude for the lessons they taught you. I was no longer the lost middle child trying desperately to earn acceptance from people who were determined not to give it. I was Linda, 29 years old, surrounded by chosen family who saw my worth clearly and celebrated it freely. And for the first time in my life, that felt like more than enough. Have you ever had to make the difficult decision to walk away from family members who couldn't accept you for who you are? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below about how you found your chosen family or rebuilt relationships on more honest foundations. Please hit that like button. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more real-life family stories that explore the complicated dynamics we all navigate, and share this with anyone who might need to hear that they deserve to be valued and celebrated exactly as they are. Remember, sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is stop trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for you and start creating spaces where you can truly belong. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope whatever family situation you're facing, you find the strength to choose relationships that honor your worth. Here's to new beginnings and the beautiful families we create when we have the courage to be authentically ourselves.